very honored that we've got those two great plenary speakers, and the first one, which I could, I guess, introduce as the founding father of intercultural studies, if you don't mind. And if I would like to tell in how many cities and how many universities Professor had his lectures, probably we will be sitting here for 45 hours listening only to this splendid CV. So let me only tell you that he's the author of many publications on theoretical grounds, but also very practical ways how to make people understand each other if they come from different parts of the world or different cultures, different spheres. So, he is the author of so-called Bennett's model. So let us enjoy the privilege of having you, Professor, here and give us some of your knowledge. And yeah.
Actually, we're a relatively small group. Can you hear me when I talk this way? Maybe I'll start out by using this. App that they're using. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for this invitation to come to Crow's Nose. I've never been here before. I had a nice drive across the countryside, and lovely to be here to meet the wonderful organizers of the conference. So thank you for this invitation. I was speaking last night to some of the presenters and found that many of them were studying humor, and it made me feel that perhaps I should have a joke to begin this talk, as many American talks do. You know, they start out with a joke. Although I've also spoken many times in Japan. In Japan, for the most part, people don't tell jokes at all at the beginning. They make an apology for something. Typically, I'm sorry, I have absolutely nothing to say, or some other thing like that. So I decided to put those together and simply apologize for not having a joke in my beginning. The relevant point, I think, from what you said by introduction is I'm interested in communication. And I believe that if we don't communicate with one another across our differences, that we are in more trouble than we currently are. We're heading to more trouble. That the movement of the world seems to be towards more connection, more interconnectivity. That movement also seems to include the preservation of our individual identities, our identities rooted in territory and in place. Somehow those things have to go together. Somehow our rooted identity and some kind of global interconnection need to learn how to live together. And this is the basis for much of my work. I began by studying physics. You will see some influence of that in the slides that I'm about to show you. But that I ended up from my undergraduate degree in cognitive psychology, and then went off to live for a couple of years in an undeveloped place in the world, traditional society. Very wonderful experience. And then came back to finish a degree, and actually something rather related to this conference, psycholinguistics. I did discourse analysis and other work associated with linguistics, and then did a PhD in intercultural communication sociology. But intercultural communication is specifically the study of the coordination across cultural groups. And I wish to share some of that with you from the perspective of style. And I've renamed this talk a bit. Let's see if I can bring the slides up here. should you be interested in resources, this website, intercultural.org, www.intercultural.org, has a lot of downloadable PDF files under resources. So should you be looking for anything to follow up on some of the ideas here, please feel free to take a look at that. I've renamed this a bit. A constructivist approach to, rather than perception style, I'm saying using perception as an ethic intercultural category. So what I'd like to do is to explain to you what that means for about the first half of this talk. And in the second half of the talk, I'd like to explore this idea of using perception as a way of understanding, or perhaps coordinating across these specific cultural differences. So I begin with my physics background. These are paradigms. This is using the term paradigm from Thomas Kuhn, his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Some of you may know it's the most referenced book in Western society, next to the Bible. Apparently the Bible is more referenced source. Thomas Kuhn famously wrote that science is not simply a linear movement where everybody builds on everybody else, but it moves through steps, and these steps are called paradigms. And there's one paradigm that's developed and more or less comes to an end, and then the knowledge that has been gained during that paradigm is reframed into a new paradigm, and that goes on for some time, and then it's reframed into another paradigm. So this paradigm shift appears to be the movement, more of a step function movement rather than a linear development in science. My observation is that social science follows physics. So for the most part, these paradigms began in physics and then they are taken over into social science. In fact, the entire idea of social science is trying to apply principles of physical science to understanding social phenomena, and that continues to be the case. What social science has not been quite so aware of is that the paradigms are shifting in physics, and that those paradigms are slowly coming into social science, changing the way in which social science approaches its topics, but sometimes without a lot of awareness on the part of the social scientists themselves. Probably it's because we don't have courses in the philosophy of social science, as does physics have lots of courses in the philosophy of physics or the philosophy of science, which look specifically at these points. Anyway, I'd like to start with pretty much the Newtonian paradigm. This is not the start of science in the world. There are many strains of science in non-Western societies. There is a strong Islamic tradition of society during the Middle Ages that predates the Newtonian or post-Enlightenment science of Europe. Nevertheless, much of our social science that we're discussing here is based in post-Enlightenment Western science, and so I begin at this point. Newtonian paradigm is based on the idea that the observer, an observer, can look at an objective reality that is outside of him or her. There is an objective reality, an a priori reality, which has an absolute or universal existence, and that we, as observers, are able to kind of look in that direction and see whatever it is. One implication of that is that our perception is passive. That basically, we are in a position of allowing things to come in, and then maybe we decide to select it or do some other things, but for the most part, what's out there is coming in through our senses. The implication for culture is basically there is no culture. The implication for culture is that since everything is a single universal reality, so we as human beings live in civilization, we don't live in culture. And that these civilizations can, for the most part, be organized according to this hierarchy, which many of you will recognize has driven colonialism, imperialism, and quite a number of other isms, forms, continues to do so. The civilized people up at the top are the ones who, of course, define this. Whoever it is that's saying we live in a pyramid, put themselves barbarians are the people who are not as civilized as we are. It's not as civilized as we are, but they could be. We could help them to become more civilized, so we can bring our colonial or imperial or nation-building skills to bear. The savages, unfortunately, are not as human as we are, and so it's okay to exploit them, and if necessary, to kill them. I'm sorry to say that this view, which was actually quite dominant at the beginning of the last century, has not yet left us. I'm sure that you see murmurs, echoes of some of the political discourse that's going on today. For the most part, these people feel that they belong there. These people feel that they are entitled to be in this position here for one reason or another, because they're smarter or richer or God is on their side. And these people here deserve to be where they are, and only if they attain the civilization of these other people will they rise up. It's a kind of social Darwinism, where fitness is defined as rising up to the top of this hierarchy of civilization. So when we look at the modernity and the term that's used to refer to this idea, is the notion that we're moving on a teleological line. Teleology means moving towards some ideal end state. So we are moving through teleological development towards an ideal end state, defined by, of course, the people who consider themselves civilized. So many Americans, for instance, think that the world is naturally moving towards a state of, up until recently, liberal democracy. Now it's unclear what Americans think is the ideal end state, but leave that aside. Similarly, Chinese people may feel that we're moving towards an ideal end state of historical circular history. And of course, the various isms. Currently, neoliberalism is we see rising under the name of populism in many societies. But it's based on the same idea that there is an ideal end state and that group will take us there. When we apply this idea to culture, we see that culture is, for the most part, denigrated as the folkways of primitive people. It's not civilization. That, in fact, what we'd like to do is to get rid of culture and move to this position of a greater civilization. And we can do that through colonialization or imperialism or these other activities. Now, in physics, the Newtonian view of the world is considered to be quite outmoded. I would say in social science, this view of the world is as well considered to be a bit naive, be considered naive realism. However, politically, I'd have to say this is still alive and well, this idea, and frequently attributed to a social science base. For most of us who work in the field of culture and cultural relations, we have shifted already to an Einsteinian paradigm. The Einsteinian paradigm, of course, is based on the idea of relativity. It's based on the idea, as Einstein so famously introduced at the beginning of the last century, that we are necessarily constrained by our perspective. We cannot see the world as it is. We can only see the world from our point of view, from our context. The observer is dependent on this context. Therefore, civilization cannot be understood in terms of some absolute ideal. It must be understood in its own terms, and thus the generation of cultural relativity, which is for the most part the assumption that most of us in this room share. This is the idea that rather than looking at societies as the fittest, we rather look at societies and cultures as existing within their own context, definable according to their own sets of standards, values, beliefs, ethics, and so forth. And that we cannot impose a single standard on these societies. So and this is called postmodernism. This is the inevitability of limited perspective. The most famous postmodern thing that you study, I'm sure, is called critical theory. And virtually everybody in universities these days studies critical theory, and it's based on this idea of postmodern limitation of or subjectivity. One of the recent implications of postmodernism is what we in the US are calling truthiness, after one of the late night comedians who labeled something or other, one of these politicians, who said some outrageous thing, and everybody said, but that's not true. And but the politician or his apologist said, no, but it has the feeling of truth. And that's important. If it has the feeling of truth, that makes it truthy. So it's not really truthful in the sense of factual. It's truthful in the sense of telling it the way it is, of generating an appropriate feeling. And this is becoming, of course, known as the clash of narratives. So politics is no longer about who's telling the truth. Politics is increasingly about who's got the best narrative. And many of you know this from your own work on social media. If you're on social media, you know that in many cases, the number of hits or views that something on social media get has little to do with its actual accuracy and a lot more to do with the power of its narrative. Some of you even know that that's true with your CVs. All relations as a result of this. But once you have this idea here that everybody exists in their own kind of context, there's not much way that these people can communicate with each other. And as a result, we have a tendency to think that the only way that people can communicate is via power. The only reason that I would talk to you is to try to impose my narrative on you. And the only reason that you would talk to me is to impose your narrative on me. And it's very difficult to imagine that we might be trying to talk to each other to in fact understand your point of view. Because locked into our perspective, I'm in fact unable to understand your point of view. All I can do is to define your point of view in my terms. And therefore, everything is a clash of power. So the clash of narrative is really a clash of who has the power to impose their narrative. Dominant groups that are dominant insofar as they have been successful in imposing their narrative on others. In other words, they set the rules. Cultural relativism then represents, we can't compare cultures to other cultures, and the other assumption here is that the existence of cultural diversity is inherently good, and since the dominant group is trying to impose their narrative on everybody else, the non-dominant groups need to be protected. And so much of the political correctness or diversity and inclusion work that's occurring not just in the US but throughout the world is based on the idea that non-dominant groups will be destroyed by dominant groups if the dominant group can do so, and therefore must be protected. An interesting assumption, which in many ways is now backfiring. Backfiring means that the assumption that we need to protect non-dominant groups is being now used by other minority groups, like neo-Nazis, to say, we are a group, and we're not dominant, but you have to protect us. And you have to respect us. You have to give us the same, honor us in the same way that you would honor any other group. So essentially, cultural relativism has been hijacked by people who would, if they could, destroy cultural relativism. It's an interesting position, and one I think that that legislates are looking seriously at something that has happened in physics more or less a century ago, and that is the shift to the quantum paradigm. And the quantum paradigm is based on the idea that we are observers interacting with that which we are observing. That is, that the world is not simply provided out there, nor do we just have a perspective on the world, but it is our observation of the world which is interacting with what happens in the world. We cannot be, we're not separate from that which we are observing and interacting. that this interaction is called co-ontology, or it's a co-ontogenic relationship. When we think of culture in these terms, we think, this is the famous dialectic of Berger and Luckman, social work, constructivist sociology, constructivist. They say that we can think of culture in two different ways, in terms of big C culture and little c culture. Big C culture, which is pronounced culture, as in let's go out and do something cultural tonight. Well, what would you do if you went out to do something cultural? In Milan, you go to the opera, you go maybe to the cinema, you might go to eat, but it wouldn't be something, it would be cuisine. But basically, you're participating in the institutions of a culture, but it could be educational institutions, religious institutions, culinary institutions, all of the various structures of a society. The little c culture over here, pronounced culture, is the experience of that. It's the worldview. It's the way people organize their experience. And what Berger and Luckman said is that these two things are connected. We are socialized into a society of institutions. We in turn engage in behavior that enacts roles within those institutions and thus perpetuating the institution. So it's a dialectic of experience being enacted in ways that support the institutions, which in turn guide our experience. Like this. And that different groups of people do this differently. We coordinate meaning and action within groups of people who are operating inside some kind of boundary. And that boundary could be an ethnic boundary. So one tribal group organizes itself differently than another tribal group. They have different institutions, but they have different experiences as well, a different worldview. Could be by national groups. That's, so Italians organize themselves differently than Swiss people or French people. It's true, but at the same time, Northern Italians organize themselves somewhat differently than Southern Italians. U.S. Americans organize themselves a bit differently than Canadians, but within the U.S. American context, Texans organize themselves differently than the Californians, and so forth and so forth. Down to being able to put the boundary, for instance, around a gender group and say that in many circumstances, men organize meaning and action differently than women do in circumstances, that different corporations have different corporate cultures. So this goes down to the level, just usually families are considered to be a bit too small to maintain a culture like this, although in many ways the dynamics of family follow pretty much the same idea. So this is the way I'm using the term culture. The issue facing us in the world today is how do we deal with the notion that we have culture A, which is a coordinating system of big C and little c culture, culture B, which is also a coordinating system, but different than A, and C and D and E and F and G and a multitude of these different cultural groups, all in contact with one another, increasingly, exponentially coming into contact, or at a greater and greater rate. What do we do about that? Like, do we just wait for one of them to dominate? Do we decide who should assimilate to whom? Do we define the universal culture and say, let's all be like that? Or something else? And it's the something else that forms the basis of intercultural communication, and I suspect also, if you were to put a word to it, much of the work of the people in discourse analysis. And that is to look for a kind of meta-coordination, a kind of bridging that allows us to acknowledge how these different groups are doing this differently, and to coordinate across those groups for some purpose, such as to maintain a governing structure, to coordinate Polish, French, Italian, and German cultures in such a way as to maintain the European Union. Something like that. Well, this is a case of postmodernism. There are some better words for it, but since I already put in modernism, postmodernism, I thought I'd keep it up. Postmodernism. So this is the notion that reality
is being constructed, that we are in the process of constructing reality. That doesn't make it less real. It just means that we're in the process of constructing it. The fact that we constructed a locomotive, that carries a train, that's a human construction, isn't it? But that doesn't mean you should stand in front of it. It's going to kill it. So it's as real as anything. It's just that it's been constructed. And what we're dealing with is the kind of reality in the world that is constructed. See this line right here? Wasn't there before, but I just constructed this line. If you cross this line, I'm going to kill you. Is it real? Well, I mean, in one sense, no. I mean, it wasn't there before, and I just put it there. On the other hand, if you walk across it, I'll kill you. What could be more real than that? So we are in the process of creating reality in as real a sense as you can imagine, which is life and death. Groups of people then are coordinating their meaning and action by agreeing to construct their perception in roughly similar ways. So in this room, as people who live in largely Western, as opposed to African or Asian or other huge regional areas of the world, who are living in this kind of Western or Western societies, have agreed to coordinate our perception in particular ways. When you look at me, you in fact are seeing something rather similar, I suspect. But even amongst ourselves, we're paying attention to slightly different things. How many of you, for instance, how many of you have noticed what kind of shoes I have? Most of you not.
Black.
Thank you, black, okay. But you wouldn't care to speculate on the brand of the shoes or, how they look with the pants or anything like that. If you were a group of Italians, like half of you would have raised your hand. Well, of course we noticed your shoes. Because if you're going to stand up, I'm afraid to walk out there now. If you're going to stand up in front of us and give a speech, we're going to look at how you're dressed because how you're dressed is part of your presentation of yourself to us. And if it looks like you're not dressed thoughtfully, which means that you have a belly Buddha, if you're not dressed thoughtfully, it means that you don't care about us. And since Italians organize their perception, not just in terms of what you say, but also who's saying it and how much credibility do they have, they will attribute credibility to me as a speaker, partially depending on how it is, what care I've shown in preparing myself visually to give this speech. Now, U.S. Americans, for the most part, don't do that. I can't speak for those of you here in this audience, but from the fact that you didn't raise your hands, I'm suspecting you're also not using that particular criteria for credibility. It's more likely that you're listening to what I'm saying and deciding whether it makes sense. So, global and multicultural situations, cultural groups need to meta-coordinate, as I've said, their action amongst themselves. The EU wants to survive, it needs to figure out how to coordinate different national groups. If the EU wants to provide aid to Africa, it needs to figure out how to coordinate with African cultures. It can't just go in and say, we're the EU, we're the dominant group, you're the receiving group, we're going to tell you what to do with this money. Can't do that. I've been working recently with the EU partnership and cooperation people, and unfortunately that's what they think. But then so do the Americans and so do the Chinese, so but those of us who are studying this say, if we want to be coordinating an overall increase in the quality of life throughout the world, it needs to be done through this meta-coordination process. It can't be done by imposing one view on another. That creates revolution. This meta-coordination demands intentionality. And this intentionality, I believe, has two aspects to it. One of them is self-reflection, or sometimes referred to as awareness or mindfulness, which is to be aware of yourself in your situation, to be aware of your context, to be mindful of your presence. The other part of it is consciousness, I think. And consciousness, I believe, is a more self-reflexive rather than self-reflective process. one which allows us to intentionally modify our actions so as to lead towards this meta coordination. That typically it works like this: that you are enacting to some extent culture A, I'm enacting to some extent culture B. We have to do something together. Now we have to plan this conference, right? But you want to plan this conference in culture A way, and I want to plan it in culture B way. So what do we do? I mean, do you dominate? Do I dominate? Do we just fight? Do we bring in a third person as a mediator? You know, how do we do it? Or do we say, here I am wanting to do things in a B way. There you are wanting to do things in an A way. How could I be adapting to your style and you be adapting to my style sufficiently to generate a third position, which we call, by the way, third culture, to develop a third position that would allow us to move forward in that third position? And that's what we call that mutual adaptation. But to do that mutual adaptation demands that we be conscious. It means that I have to intentionally adapt my behavior. It's not just re-assimilating to another culture. I'm not being re-acculturated. I am intentionally modifying my behavior to get along in this situation or to accomplish a purpose in this situation. And I'll give you some examples of how we could be doing that coming up. Now, this process of attempting to modify our behavior has historical roots. And intercultural communication, for the most part, is based on this idea, although there's a particular form of intercultural called intercultural constructivism that I believe emphasizes this. Beginning with the development of cultural relativism with Franz Boas and Margaret Mead, the early 20th century, it's counteracting this notion of social Darwinism that somehow the most wonderful people are percolating to the top of that pyramid. So to counteract that, this was an intentional act on the part of anthropologists to say, no, you can't do that. This in turn allowed, just a bit later in that century, around the 20s into the 30s, the development of linguistic relativism. Now, linguistic relativism was a very, very radical idea at the time. It was the idea that language and culture were related to one another, that culture was this organization of experience, A different than B different than C, and that was in many ways mirrored in the language, that the language became the habitual way of organizing our experience. The language expressed that habitual way of perceiving things in the world. And this continues to be an important concept in the discourse analysis of the work of communication style. Benjamin Whorf, reality is not simply given to us, but presents itself as a kaleidoscopic flux, which we organize largely as a function of the linguistic systems of our minds. The basic statement of linguistic relativism. Now, the positivists who were around at this time didn't like linguistic relativism at all, and they called it linguistic determinism. And they said, so what you're saying, Mr. Whorf, Mr. Sapir, what you're saying is that language, the language you speak, determines how you perceive reality. In fact, they really weren't saying that. They were saying that the language codifies habitual ways of organizing reality. But the positivists, they didn't have the idea of habitual ways of organizing reality, so they said, well, there's a reality, there isn't. And so what you're saying is that language is determining how people are seeing reality as if there was more than one. And then many experiments were done to suggest that people could perceive things outside of linguistic categories, which by the way is true. I myself had that experience. I was teaching English in this place in Micronesia, Trump district in the Eastern Carolina Islands, Pacific Ocean, where I lived for this 2 years. And I was teaching English. One of the things I was doing, building docks, doing other things. But anyway, part of it was teaching English to 6th graders. Maybe you've had this experience. But the way you do that, you have this little card. It's got these little balls on it with different colors. And you start out by giving the pattern. This is a yellow ball. The group goes, that's a yellow ball. And you go, this is a yellow ball. But that's a yellow ball. And pretty soon you just hold it up and they go, that's a yellow ball. And in that way they learn how to make the statement and also to recognize the color. So that was working fine until I held up the blue ball. And they said, that's a blue ball. I said, this is a blue ball. They went, that's a blue ball. So, but they could say it, it's just they couldn't see it. You know, and I held up the green ball and the same thing happened. So I knew this War-Sapir hypothesis, and I knew that in many cultures in the world, color distinctions are not made the same way. Now, the people criticizing Worf and Sapir have done some exercises, some experiments to show that people, if you put two colors next to one another, people can say, oh yeah, they're different. But what they're failing to recognize is whether we habitually make that distinction or not. And it turns out in Micronesia, people don't habitually make that distinction. I went out to a little kid out on the playground and didn't know any English. And I said to this little kid, hey, what color is the sky? He says, Ada. I said, what color is the ocean? Ada. What color is that tree? Ada. What color is the grass? Ada. So everything I was pointing to that I thought were blue and green, this kid was using the same word for it. And sure enough, Micronesians do not habitually generate the distinction between blue and green. It's not important for them. Just like, does anybody ski in here? How many different kinds of snow are there? And probably 6 or 8, you know, that are important to you, particularly if you're a competitive skier. You know what kind of snow is really important. How about somebody who doesn't ski? How many kinds of snow are there? Dirty snow and clean snow. Wet snow and dry snow or something like that. It's the same thing. It's not that there really are or not different kinds of snow. It's that we make distinctions of the snow depending on whether that's important to us or not. So, and likewise in Micronesia, it wasn't particularly important for these people to make the distinctions between blue and green, so they didn't. Except when we taught them English, in which case they learned to make the distinction. So basically, this idea has been an extremely important idea in the development of intercultural communication. Ruth Benedict, Edward T. Hall, and others realized that this notion of separate cultures meant if we couldn't compare cultures in terms of how civilized they are, how could we compare cultures? And if we didn't compare cultures, how could we communicate? How could we predict misunderstanding? How could we coordinate if we didn't have some way of comparing cultures? And so they generated the idea of etic observational categories. Etic from a parallel to phonetic as opposed to phonemic analysis. And so the etic categories were constructed for the purpose of generating observational comparisons. Individualism and collectivism, for instance, is a famous one. Or the other one from Edward T. Hall was high context and low context. There is no such thing as an individualistic society. There is only individualism observations. So let's say some more about this in a moment. But these categories are observational categories. They're not categories of culture. And the problem that's occurred in our field and along with others is mistaking the notion of observation, which is a constructivist notion, with the idea of a taxonomy or a categorization, which is basically a positivist idea. So the dialectic of objective and subjective, which I talked about from Berger and Luckman, came in here. A lot of psycholinguistic interaction analysis, and you'll recognize these names, of course. The Brzozowski, we did as a general semanticist, but Gumperz, Tannen, Deborah Tannen, of course, Rita Lakoff, along with George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, and others that are in many ways precedent now in the idea of metaphor and the construction of narrative through language. Then some other people that are less familiar, maybe to some of you, George Kelly, who was a psychologist who wrote a book called The Psychology of Personal Constructs, who made something that I think is a good statement, particularly for those of you who might be thinking about going on an Erasmus exchange. Any of you in here either done that or thinking about doing that. Doing one of these kind of exchanges. Here's the statement or paraphrase anyway, of the statement that Kelly makes about that. He says, experience is not a function of being in the vicinity of events when they occur. Rather, he says, experience is a function of how you construe those events or how you interpret the events. And if you don't interpret the events differently, you're not going to have a different experience. So here's what I've discovered. I'll pick on the Americans. So when an American woman goes to France, she wants to have a French experience. I guarantee you she does. She wants to have a French experience. So she goes to France and she's standing around in Paris waiting for a French experience to happen to her. Is it? No! Well, probably not, at least not in Kelly's terms. What's going to happen to her is she's going to have an American experience in the vicinity of French events. She's not going to have a French experience until she does one very important thing. You know what it is? Not meet a boyfriend. Okay. That might be part of it. What is it? She needs to organize her experience in a more French way. She needs to interpret events around her in a more French way. Then she'll have a French experience. Otherwise, she's having an American experience in the vicinity of French events. And that's true for you as well. When you go someplace, if you don't know how to reorganize your experience intentionally into an alternative set of interpretations for what's going on around you, you're not going to have the experience of that place. Because it's not from being around the vicinity, it's not from eating the food. It's from eating the food and interpreting that act in the way that people live there habitually. Anyway, so he was a good guy in talking about this constructivist view, as was Paul Watzlawick, who is famous for his work in radical constructivism. And then finally, I have immodestly put myself at the end of this list, Gregory Bateson, who's a crossover anthropologist and communication person. His student was Dean Barnland, and I'm Dean Barnland's student. So I'm in this line of Bateson, Barnland, and Bennett, who are trying to apply these constructivist principles specifically to intercultural communication. The reason I'm giving you this list is not that I want you to memorize the history of intercultural communication. I want to point out that there is such a thing. That there is a coherent lineage of people who are studying essentially this idea of how do we meta-communicate, how do we meta-coordinate across coordinating systems. Now, the etic, let me talk to you a little bit about the constructed etic category. The etic category is, in fact, a kind of distribution of probability. And so we generate, this is one of the most famous etic categories, individualism and collectivism. Once again, let me say to you, there is no society that is individualistic and no society that's collectivist. These are not descriptions of culture, these are descriptions of observation. This is what we bring to try to see a difference, that is, Bateson would say, a difference that makes a difference to communication. So, and in fact, this is a pretty good one. When we look, for instance, at Chinese folks, we would say that they are more likely to organize their world in collectivist ways, which largely means intergroup dependence. And that US Americans are more likely, or North Americans anyway, are more likely to organize their experience in individualistic ways, which means being more self-reliant. So, if you observe North Americans compared to Chinese, you are more likely to find self-reliance as an organizing principle amongst the North Americans than you are amongst the Chinese. But it doesn't mean that North Americans are that way. Look, there are a whole bunch of North Americans who actually use more intergroup kinds of styles. And there are a whole bunch of Japanese who use more individualistic styles. So this is really a distribution of probability. It's not a distribution of quality itself. For those of you who like it when I talk this way, with avoiding reification. People who are outside 2 standard deviations from the norm we can call deviants. Every society has its made up of deviants. And there are a lot of people around who, when they're around Chinese folks, can organize their experience in a more collectivist way. And when they're around US Americans, can organize their experience in a more individualistic way. And this becomes particularly important when we realize that we can put other labels on that. Like, it is also the case that if you observe men and women in many situations, women tend to use more intergroup interdependence. Men tend to use more self-reliant strategies. And if men and women want to understand each other, and this is of course assuming such a thing is possible, but were you to accept that it was possible, what they would need to do, what men would need to do, is to try to organize the world in a more interdependent way, and women would need to be able to organize the world in a more self-reliant. In other words, men and women spend a lot of time in the vicinity of each other's events, but they don't spend much time trying to reorganize their experience in the other side. So that's what you can do with these edit categories, is that you can observe differences that might make a difference to coordinating across the two groups. That's the purpose. So the typical edit categories that most of you are familiar with, this is one set that I've been using for many years. Phatic or ritual language, this is of course a big part of discourse analysis, ritual Deborah Tannen, it's very good. For those of you who follow Tannen's work, very good on looking at ritual breeding, like she's the one who pointed out something that I had observed as well, and I was very pleased to see her write this in the Argument Culture, or Just to Understand, one of her popular books, where she had noted that when men, particularly U.S. American and mostly U.S. American white males, meet one another, they frequently greet each other with an insult. They'll say something like, "You look like shit today," or why don't you turn that hat around and put it the other way? And that when what you're supposed to do is to come back then with a counter insult. Like not half as bad as you, or I didn't really feel the need to, put on my Sunday clothes or something like that. And what it is that we could do is change insults, and that would make the world safe for our ensuing interaction. She pointed out that women tend not to do that, as a rule. When women meet one another, what are they more likely? Remember, this is probability. This is not, here's what women are like. What's the greater probability when women meet one another? Women, a lot of women. What are you more likely to do when you meet somebody? Are you likely to say, "You look terrible today"? No. Are you likely to make some kind of a compliment? I've talked to a lot of women about this, and they say, because the men, when they hear the women saying, "Oh, I love your earrings," the men are going, "God." They think that the women are just fake. They're just acting up. But when you talk to the women, they say, "No, you look for something that you can sincerely compliment. You're not just thinking of something." So, okay, now, so why am I telling you this? There's a very practical reason. This is a difference that may make a difference to communication. I work a lot in corporations, and I work with multicultural situations, particularly gender, where there are a lot of gender differences. And this has happened many times. I've seen this event where a man is the supervisor of a work group, and a woman joins the work group. And the man, after a few weeks, wants the woman to feel like she's part of the group. So she shows up in the morning and he says, "You look like shit this morning," right? And she goes, "Ah!" And she's not. She doesn't feel like she's part of the group. On the other hand, you see it being worked the other way as well, which is the woman is the supervisor of the group. And after a few weeks, she wants the man to feel like he's part of the group. So she says to him, "I love your tie." Now, men mostly don't say that to each other. "I love your tie," right? He'd be waiting for the other shoe to drop, like, "Too bad you couldn't get a tie better like that," or something. So it would turn it into an insult, and then it would be okay, right? But if it comes without the insult, "I love your tie," the man is going, and he puts it into the only category that he has for compliments, which is, "She wants it." This is the only possible explanation for why I'm receiving this compliment. So what you have then is the potential for a kind of petty harassment situation, which is entirely based on misinterpretations. And of course, you know this is the basis of a lot of discourse analysis that you do. Deborah Tam is of course, a master at doing that. This, we can also look at this as an etic category insofar as we see it being more probable that men would use this kind of a greeting ritual compared to nonverbal behavior, of course. My favorite is eye contact. Once again, most of you know that U.S. Americans use a kind of a middle range eye contact. They look at you, they look away, they look at you like this, they look away like this. When it's your turn, they look at you and stop talking. You can feel it, can't you? It's your turn. Right? And that, okay, it's more probable that you'll see that amongst Americans. Amongst Germans as a group, it's more likely that you'll see somebody making this kind of eye contact. Should have looked away by now. I have, because I just keep looking at you. And it's impolite for you to look away, so you keep looking at me. And pretty soon you're going, whoa, we don't even know each other. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And it gets worse because when it's your turn, I look away. So you think I'm pausing so you don't say anything, and I go, she's going to say it, so I start talking again. And we basically, we're not coordinating turn taking. That's minimally the communication difficulty that we have. Maximally, I was called in one time as a consultant to a study abroad program where they were about to terminate the homestay coordinator. The reason is sexual harassment. But they said, we're not quite sure. All we know is that the women are complaining, so go find out what's going on. So I went and I interviewed the women, and I interviewed these are young American women, and I interviewed the guy, and I couldn't get anything, so I watched the interaction. What do you know? Intense, direct eye contact. And nobody had told these young American women that Germans tended to use more intense and longer lasting eye contact. So they were interpreting that in the only way that they had, which is if a U.S. American male did that, which it would probably mean he was coming on to them, right? So they all thought, well, this guy must be coming on to us. Why? Because they weren't having a German experience. They were having an American experience in the vicinity of German fans. So we solved this problem by saying to the guy, back off the eye contact. Right? And we said to the women, hey, you know what? When you go to Germany and lots of places in Northern Europe, people make more intense eye contact. But God was about ready to lose his job over this. So this is what I mean by differences that make a difference. Right? And I'm using relatively small examples, but it's possible that if we applied it to North Korea, we might come up with some other more dramatic ones. Of course, communication style, we tend to use this in intercultural to mean specifically the construction of a message, although I think that in the field of discourse analysis, communication styles are used a little more broadly. Cognitive style, or habitual patterns of thought, again, part of discourse analysis. And cultural values, once again, we should be careful to not think of values as things, but as assignments of things. So what people have values. People assign labels to things. If we assume that people have values, we've fallen into reification again. So we have to assume that values do not exist. What exists is our observation of the assignment of goodness. And we can see that, yes, indeed, people assign goodness in different ways to, are more likely to do so across cultural groups. Once again, this is a lot of conceptual framing in a short period of time. And the point that I'm trying to make to you is not that you should immediately understand this. It is that you should recognize that this exists. That this is an organization of a field of study that is probably important and maybe increasingly important to us. So here, let me reiterate the construction of perception, dissecting nature along lines laid down by our native language. The second statement is one that I think was originally attributed to Sapir, although it's included in Science and Linguistics by Moore. We cut nature up, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significance as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns form. Once again, if you think this is old because it's from 1940, pick up a copy of Lakoff's book, Women, Fire, and Other Dangerous Things, in which he makes the case for essentially resurrecting this view from the ravages of the positivists. So here's a kind of another kind of thing back from the 50s. This is a famous study done by Letman and Alberto Matallana, and Colin Fitz as well, but the people that have ended up sort of talking about this more have been Letman and Matallana. And this has to do with the observation that frogs don't just see things and then decide whether to pay attention or not. They don't see them in the first place. The way this experiment was done, and I apologize to you frogophiles out here, but a little microelectrode is put into the optic nerve of the frog, and the frog's eyes are held open. And a dot is moved on a screen in front of the frog. And when the dot is moved in roughly parallel or oblique directions, you get this kind of. But if the dot is moved up and down, there's a, and then it goes silent. What these researchers concluded from this is that unlike the positivist view that perception is as a passive process of allowing what's out there in the world to come in fact, at the retina, in this case of the frog, at the retina of the frog, already decisions are being made about what to pay attention to. And as far as the frog's concerned, when the little dot moves up and down like this, there's nothing happening. You know, there's no perceptual response whatsoever. Well, why would that be the case, do you think? This is a frog that eats flies, by the way. Like that. Why would it be the case that it didn't see things move up and down like that?
Because flies don't.
Because flies don't move up and down like that. They move sideways, they move obliquely, but they don't move up and down exactly. It's a fly detector mechanism. It's not important for this frog to see flies like this, to see movement like this, because flies don't move that way. Any more than it's important for you to see 6 kinds of snow, right? Dirty and clean is just fine. Now, what we know from much more current work, this is from 2014, and this is a model that's being used to develop a nano computing system, a feature detector of nano computing. And what they're talking about this is as a brain-based, neuroscience-based model. And what they're doing is using essentially the same model for looking at how human perception works, and then using that as a model for these nanocomputers. Here's the raw visual input coming in. Here's the retina, where already things are being organized in the retina. So if we go back here, see, this is the cell structure of the retina. The light's actually coming in from this direction here. The cones and rods and other ganglia are up here on the other end. What happens is the light moves through these cell surround structures. The cell surround structures are subject to, see this little arrow coming in here? This means that information is coming from the central nervous system into the retina, and it's essentially telling your eye whether to see something. It's activating the structure so as to make it sensitive to the light. And then here, that little arrow there, are the impulses from these subsequently stimulated neurons that send the pulse back to the lateral nucleus and other places in your central nervous system. In other words, what's going on here at the retina of the eye is an interaction of afferent and afferent nervous. What that does is that's called pre-processing. What that means is that your expectation about what it is that you're going to see is already built in to the retina of your eye. It could be done differently, but in general, the expectation of seeing something in a particular way is already there. So, for instance, you know that, here, let me show it to you. Just hold on for a second. See that? Okay. What do you see? Do you see the faces or do you see the face? Can you see them both at the same time? Yeah. No, you actually can't. Yeah. If we put your brain into a magnetic resonance, you know, your brain state shifts as you shift from one to the other. So, but you can go back and forth pretty fast because we know how to make that shift. But in most cases, here's another one. In most cases, we've learned, our culture tells us to pay attention to one of those things or the other. Pay attention to the blue part, but not the red part. Pay attention to the red, and not the blue. And when I say your culture tells you that, I mean that you habitually learn to organize your perception in that way. So that's what I mean by the habitual organization of this perceptual structure. So here we have this system for organizing your perception in particular ways. Now, the only reason for showing this model is to explain what this next model, I'm going to leave you with this model. And this is what I'm playing with now. This is sort of current research that I'm doing. There's a pre-publication. It's into a handbook of intercultural training, but I'm about ready to go back and totally rewrite the article because I think there's some it has to do with the cultural construction of perception. So what I'm suggesting here is that different cultural groups habitually organize their perception in different ways. That we can organize it in terms of relatively close to the percept, meaning that it's not very processed, and we have the what. Or we can organize it in terms of action sequences, which is how. We can organize it in terms of conceptual structure, which is why. We can organize it in terms of who else is around that, what's the relational quality of it, who, and we can talk about it in terms of the form of a story on where. When we organize things in these different ways, you notice I'm not putting any cultural groups associated with this yet. I want you to speculate a little bit. Sensory data, in this case, is left relatively unprocessed. Sensory data here is organized by the action sequence. So if you ask this person here, tell me about the day-to-day, this person is likely to say, I can smell winter coming. You can smell the autumn in the air. You can taste the rain. You can feel that the wind is becoming a little chillier. In other words, these are people who are organizing their perception of the world in terms of immediate sensory information. If you ask this person here, tell me about the world, that person is likely to say, well, first I woke up, then I had breakfast, then I drove to work, and there was a lot of traffic, but now I'm here pretty much on time. In other words, they organize, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? You organize your world into action sequences. If you ask this person here, tell me about the world, he or she's likely to say, today is the day that William of Orange invaded Ireland, you know, or some other kind of more historical conceptual framework. If you ask this person, tell me about the day, this person's likely to say, who's asking? Because it will make a big difference on whether I tell you, or what I tell you, depending on who it is that's asking. And when you say to this person, tell me about the day, this person's likely to say, you know, 10 years ago on this very day, somebody came to our village and suggested that we shift from doing this to doing that. And this caused all kinds of problems. And so it continues this day. In other words, I'll tell you a story. Now, when we continue this, we see that here, the coordination of folks is largely through consensus towards trying to find some certainty in people's life experiences. Here, the coordination is largely through problem solving because it's an action sequence. We say, what's the problem? How do we solve it? Here, we coordinate through strategic analysis looking for the truth. Here, we coordinate through strategic networking looking for credibility. And here, we're looking at the world through congeniality. Like, are you somebody that I want to spend time with? Somebody that I... Now, for those of you who are thinking about getting a job sometime, or are interested in issues of leadership, there are some profound implications for leadership from these different styles. That the people who are using a sensory style are more likely to be looking for leaders that are sensitive, influential, able to generate consensus. The conceptual ones are looking for leaders with cognitive depth, typically PhDs, doctor, so and so. People here are looking for people that are really good at maintaining these communication networks. People here are looking for strong, charismatic people who can generate narratives. And people here are looking for leaders that are decisive on the basis of limited information, sometimes very limited. Okay, do you have some groups in mind? I did. You know, I mean, so this is a theoretically derived set of perceptual organizations derived from the processing, different ways that we could be processing our perception. But now I'm going to show you a heuristic model. And heuristic means that there's not a lot of data to support this other than anecdotal data, but this is where I think some interesting research could be going. Some of you may want to do it. If we take this continuum of perceptual construction, which is this one here, and we organize it in terms of the more procedural on the one side and the more relational on the other side, and we anchor it with people like, say, Japanese folks on one end who, for instance, through the institution of Zen Buddhism, celebrate the idea of staying with the immediate percept. And we anchor it, on the other hand, with the Northern Europeans, like Germans, who say the most important thing is to understand the concept, the theory, you know, the concept of theoretical structure. And then we kind of move people around that. So we say that from this concrete position, about halfway down this procedural side are the North Americans, who like to think of themselves in terms of problem solvers. But that continues down through these groups here towards groups that become more abstract and conceptual, shifts over here, and I've made a speculation, shifts over here into groups that are conceptual but more relational, as opposed to conceptual and more procedural, and all the way down to operating at the most narrative, most relational level here of Northern and finally Sub-Saharan Africans, and back to the Japanese. So it's kind of the circle. Now, what could you do with this? The idea is not to describe these cultures. The idea is, can we use this as an edit category? Okay, last time. Can we use this as an edit category to define differences that may make a difference to communication? So I used to work with American companies in Japan. And I would say and the American companies would say to the Japanese, can you give us 12 units next month? And the Japanese would say, we have 7 on hand. And the Americans would say, yeah, but what about next month? Can you have 12? And the Japanese would say, we don't know, because it's not next month yet. We'll tell you next month if we have 12. The Americans are going, they say, speculate. On the other hand, when the Japanese ask the Americans, can you give us 12 units next month? The Americans say, sure, no problem. So next month they have 11. So the Japanese say, so where's the 12? And the Americans are going, 90% compliance. Pretty good. They're actually proud of themselves for having made a statement of probability with such accuracy. Here in Poland, how many days out does the weather forecast go? 3 days, 5 days, 7 days? 3. Ooh, sometimes 16, but 3 is typical. In the US, it's 10 is typical. 10 days. You know how far weather reports go out, weather forecasts go out in Japan, typically? 1 day. Sometimes they don't even go, sometimes they're just weather reports. Like, here's the weather. Look out the window. In other words, there's, for the most part, in this style, there is a disinclination to want to speculate about things. Whereas in this style here, because there's a lot of probability involved based on these action sequences, there's a strong desire to speculate. So, probability-based statistics, which is the basis of virtually all of our research, comes out of this position here. Doesn't come out of the other. Or, last example, I was working with the Italians about going to sub-Saharan Africa to do cooperation projects, and they were saying, we're going to go there and tell them how wonderful human rights are. And I said, based on this model here, you'd be far better off going down and trying to be congenial and not talking to people about human rights, but just trying to develop a good relationship, because people are going to do things, people are going to cooperate because they have a good relationship with you, not because they believe in the importance of universal human rights. So, thanks. Hope you, if you're looking for additional reading on this, there's a book, there's the website, and I'd be very happy to respond to any